Welcome to Yahoo Finance Sports Report, a unique look at the business of sports, brought to you by Yahoo Finance and Yahoo Sports. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano, and I'm here to coach you through the financial game. We're going to look beyond the headlines and analyze all the latest sports news, the teams, trades, and billion-dollar deals, so you and your portfolio will win big. This week, we're talking about some big bets over at DraftKings, taking a look at the National Women's Soccer League, looking ahead to Friday's boxing match between Mike Tyson and Jake Paul, and so much more. Plus, Donn Davis, co-founder of the Professional Fighters League, is stopping by the show to discuss all things PFL. Let's huddle up and get right into it. It's time for this week's Pomps Playbook, where I take a look at some of the biggest headlines in sports that you and your portfolio need to know. Let's kick things off with DraftKings, and more specifically, how successful NFL bettors cost the company $250 million. So DraftKings released its earnings last week, and they ended up revising their 2024 fiscal guidelines down because NFL game bets went in the favor of bettors. That's right. Because of successful NFL bettors on their platform in early Q4 so far, DraftKings has lost $250 million. The average revenue per user was also down 10% from their 2023 figures of $114 per user to $103 per user in 2024. Now, DraftKings CEO Jason Robins called this out early on in the earnings call, saying the most customer-friendly month is this month, and it's all because winning bets happened on the platform because the favorites in the NFL did so much better than they typically would do. Now, this isn't necessarily something that DraftKings need to be worried about long-term. There's sort of an ebb and flow with betting, where sometimes the favorites go on a hot streak and sometimes the underdogs do it as well. But this is certainly something that we need to be watching out for because the VIG that DraftKings was seeing on these bets was not enough to make up for the loss on the NFL bets on the flip side. The next thing I want to talk about is the National Women's Soccer League, their season-long ratings, attendance, and growth. Now, the NWSL is in the middle of its postseason with its championship final scheduled to take place on November 23rd. But the league is already seeing huge signs of growth in 2024. For example, the NWSL broke 2 million fans in regular season attendance for the first time in league history. Saturday night's doubleheader matches on Iron average 145,000 viewers with a high of 234,000 viewers for the July 6th Orlando-Kansas City match. The hard data on the business when it comes to valuation and revenue is also looking really promising, according to Sportico's 2024 report. NWSL teams are estimated to generate $215 million in regular season revenue. That's a 91% increase from last year. The average revenue per team is also expected to be around $15.4 million. That's up 60% from last year. And while each NWSL club is estimated to have annual losses between $5 to $10 million in 2024, that's sort of to be expected at this point, and the league seems to be doing a lot better than some of the other women's professional soccer leagues. Now, this revenue growth was partially driven by new TV deals for the league that began this season worth $240 million across 4 years, or $60 million annually. The NWSL is also adding an expansion club in Boston set to begin play in 2026 after paying a $53 million expansion fee, and the league is now in the process of adding a 16th team through another expansion franchise, with a decision on location expected by the end of next year. The last thing I want to talk about in Pomp's playbook, though, is the fight between Jake Paul and Mike Tyson tomorrow in Dallas. Now, this fight is especially important and a big deal because it's going to be streamed live on Netflix from the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. Jake Paul is out there claiming that 90,000 people will attend the fight in Dallas, which the stadium could technically hold, but remains to be seen because there are still a ton of tickets out there for sale. But they're also selling these ridiculously expensive hospitality packages for $2 million. That includes a bunch of things like private ringside access, a suite for 2 people. You get a spot on the stage before and after the fight. It includes an exclusive stadium arrival, personal security, and an escort for the event. And of course, you get a photo op and an opportunity to meet Mike Tyson and Jake Paul before the fight. But the thing that I'm going to be watching is how this performs for Netflix on their streaming service. It's no secret that Netflix has gotten more involved with sports over the last number of years. You have the one-off tennis tournaments, you have their deal for the NFL Christmas games, and of course, you have WWE's Monday Night Raw. Many people, which you'll hear from Donn Davis in this later episode, are expecting Netflix to also be a bidder for the UFC's rights. So it'll be interesting to see if this is a way to catapult them into more sports rights, because they certainly need it to help their advertising business as well. This week for the deeper dive, where I give you a play-by-play analysis of news in the sports world and its significance to your bottom line, we're talking about Augusta National Golf Club, and more specifically, what it takes to become a member there. Now, Sports Business Journal reported last week that Augusta National Golf Club has welcomed a new class of members. This includes NFL quarterback Eli Manning, CBS Sports Chairman Sean McManus, Amazon CEO Andy Jassy, and Delta Airlines CEO Ed Bastian joining the club. Eli Manning will now join his brother Peyton, who is also a member of the club, along with a bunch of other big names in sports and finance, including NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates. But how exactly does one become a member of it at Augusta National? What does it cost, and what are the rules? Well, let me explain. So Augusta National is unique in the fact that it's not your typical country club. Augusta National was founded in 1932, but it was initially a white men's-only club until they admitted the first African-American member, Ron Townsend, in 1990. And the club only started allowing female members after some public pressure in 2012, welcoming former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and South Carolina financier Darla Moore. The tricky part about Augusta National is that everything we know about the business is spread through word of mouth. There are a few reasons for this, but the biggest reason is because it is scheduled as a for-profit corporation, whereas most golf clubs are non-profits, meaning that they pay a little bit more in taxes, but they get to keep everything quiet. We're talking member list, dues, rules, and everything that goes on with the Masters Golf Tournament. The reason for this is because we don't want to know anything, according to them, about the actual business, what land they're acquiring or anything else like that. But with that said, here's what we do know about the membership process. Augusta National currently has about 300 members. These new members are only admitted when a spot opens up, meaning when someone dies or withdraws their membership, which obviously doesn't happen often with a club like Augusta National. Initiation fees for the club are surprisingly low at around $40,000 compared to LACC at $300,000 or $400,000 or a place like Shinnecock. Annual dues also are pretty cheap at only a few $1,000s a year, and hotel rooms on the property will only cost members about $100 a night. Potential members must be nominated by someone who is currently at the club, which is probably how Eli Manning got in there, given his brother Peyton is already a member. Golf handicaps really don't matter, as the current handicap at Augusta is around 14, and even former winners of the Masters Golf Tournament aren't necessarily given membership status. They're honorary members, which means they can play the course whenever they want. If they want to bring a guest, though, they have to meet them at the gate, and all of their foursomes always have to include a current member at Augusta. There's also a ton of rules that we don't always need to go through, but no backwards hats, no shorts, no matter how hot it is. Tipping is not allowed on the property outside of caddies, and high-stakes gambling is frowned upon. But the best part about being a member of Augusta National is tee times aren't necessarily a problem. It's estimated that there's only 20 to 30 people playing golf at Augusta during an average weekend, with that number rising to about 80 during the busiest weekends. But if you're fortunate to become a member, you're going to be walking in the halls of history. My favorite stat is that Dwight D. Eisenhower is the only U.S. president to ever be a member of Augusta National. He made 29 trips to the property, playing 210 rounds of golf during his 8-year term as U.S. president, and he was there so much that the golf club even worked with the Secret Service to build him a cabin on the property, which he'll pass while attending the Masters Golf Tournament. All right, everyone, we've made it to the one-on-one, a conversation where I get to break down news and sports with a key player in the industry. This week, I'm joined by Donn Davis, founder and co-owner of the Professional Fighters League, or PFL. Donn, thanks so much for joining me. How are you?
Joe, thanks for having me here. Congrats on the new show. Always good to talk fighting.
I love it. So maybe we start with just kind of your general overview of the competitive landscape in MMA today. Where do you see PFL and what are you watching?
Well, when you and I last talked 3 years ago, there was a UFC and nobody else. The story is really the rise of the PFL. The MMA market is now a duopoly with 2 global premium providers. If you look at the 3 measures of any sports league, the NBA or MMA, it's athlete quality, distribution, and audience. And the athlete quality in the PFL is now almost equal if you look at independent measures. We consolidated the rest of the market with top fighters. Distribution, we're in 170 countries with premium providers, including ESPN on Friday night, where UFC's Saturday night. And lastly, audience. PFL is now twice as big as MLS. They've been around 30 years. We've only been around 6 years. And we're growing 20% a year, which is almost 3 times faster than any other sports league. So the story is fans now have 2 great leagues to see. And that still only gives them, Joe, 70 fights a year. You talk a lot about basketball. You talk a lot about soccer. There's 4,000 soccer matches, 4,000 basketball games. So MMA is still very, very scarce sport, but now at least there's 2 premium companies in MMA.
Yeah, you mentioned MLS has been around for 30 years, but you forgot to mention they also have Lionel Messi, which gives them just a little bit of an advantage. But I also want to talk about talent acquisition. We were joking a little bit before this about Francis Ngannou, who was at the UFC for a period of time, was unhappy with his contractual obligations and situation there, comes over to the PFL. He has a very unique deal and structure with you guys. But just in general, how do you think about talent acquisition and acquiring the best fighters?
If you're a fighter or any kind of athlete, you want to make the most money, but also have the most control. With PFL is very different. We are a fighter driven league. In the PFL, think of it as March Madness meets MMA. In the PFL, you win, you advance. You lose, we see you next season, just like March Madness. Now, we call it a sports season format. We have a regular season, playoff, and championship. In fact, Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, is our championship. Fighters have won 3 times to get there, but they're in control. The UFC is a promoter driven organization. A promoter decides when and who will fight. Very, very different. So whether you're a Francis Ngannou, the very, very best in the world, yes, he wants to make the most money, but he also wants to have control. What Francis wanted in his control was the ability to also box. If you look at the biggest emerging star in the world, Paul Hughes, what he wanted was the control to be in the league season, go as far as he possibly can. And he's going to be fighting Nurmagomedov. He's going to be fighting our world champion in only his 3rd fight out with us. So every fighter, yes, wants to make money, but all athletes want to be in their control, go as far as they want to go. That's what the PFL really offers.
All right, we've got to take a quick break, but we'll be back with Donn Davis right after this. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance Sports Report. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano, and I'm here with Donn Davis, founder and co-owner of the Professional Fighters League. Every sports league is a little bit different, so let's keep that in mind. But for people who watch the NFL or NBA or MLB, maybe could you just explain a little bit of how you think about the business in general and where the money is coming from, right? So like the NFL, for example, I think most people realize at this point that they're making the most of their money, the majority of their money off of media rights. There's sponsorships, there's ticket sales, there's things like that. But MMA and specifically the PFL sort of feels like a completely different business in that, given that it's event driven and all that kind of stuff. Maybe just talk a little bit about how you think that breakdown is today and what it might look like in the future.
Great question. If you look at MMA, UFC and PFL, very similar in terms of business model, but MMA very different from the other sports leagues, as you point out. The first big difference is global. 50% of the revenue in MMA is outside the US. Only 10% of the big 4 sports leagues revenue is outside the US. So global is the big difference. The second big difference is asset light. In MMA, you don't have to own your stadium. You don't have to put $1 billion in your stadium. In fact, about 15% of our revenue and 15% of UFC revenue is host fee revenue. You get paid to take your event there. The third big difference is very, very few employees. UFC about 600 employees, PFL about 100 employees. The average sports team has about 3,000 employees. And the last big difference, athlete expense, very controllable. It's about 50% of the athlete expense to revenue in the big 4. The UFC, just 20% of the athlete expense to revenue. The PFL, we have about 35. So the athletes all goes to the bottom line. The asset light all goes to the, call it, return on equity bottom line. So very, very different business model MMA. And by the way, of the 160 sports teams in the world, the Dallas Cowboys are the most profitable. The UFC, twice as profitable as the Dallas Cowboys. So there's no business model like MMA in sports.
Now, I would argue it's a little bit different with the UFC given their setup, but with you guys, 35% seems good for the business, but also pretty fair for the fighters. Because if you think about the NFL and all these other leagues, they broadcast 50-50, right? But there's a lot of things that are excluded from those revenue sharing agreements that maybe make it more 40-60 or 35-65. So do you think that the business kind of lives at that 35% sharing point long term? Or do you think at some point we see unions come in play and we start to see that number rise?
I think there's 2 points that make MMA more reasonable at the 35 level. And by the way, we're almost twice the UFC, as you point out. We think fighters deserve more of their share. We've been very vocal about that. And we stand behind that by paying more money. One, there's no sport without the athletes, so we pay more. But two, it's not at the 50% level because most fighters buy the UFC or the PFL. There's very, very few big name star fighters as there are in other sports. And number three, the careers here are very, very short. They're only 5, 6, 7 years. So the athletes need to maximize their revenue. The one thing we've told our athletes, whether they're at PFL or UFC or any other, go to free agency, test the market. Very few athletes do. Very few. We estimate only 10% of the athletes in MMA ever go to free agency after the first contract. We as a company have been very vocal to our athletes, to UFC athletes, the rest of the athletes. Go to free agency, know your market worth.
One of the things that I'm interested to hear your opinion on is the rise of Saudi Arabia in combat sports specifically. They seem like they're doing a lot of stuff, not even just in other sports, but specifically combat sports. If you think about MMA and boxing, they're obviously hosting events domestically, but they're sponsoring a lot of events internationally as well. What is your guys' relationship with the Saudi Arabia, the country, but also what if you any insight you can provide into their overall strategy?
Yeah, it's been fantastic. 2 years ago, PIF, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, bought a 20% stake in PFL. Without them, we could not have put on the Francis Ngannou fight. That was an extremely expensive fight where we hosted it in Riyadh 2 weeks ago. So it's not just the investment, but it's the support. You've seen big boxing matches from GEA. You also saw the Minister of Support, the Minister of Sport, which does F1 in Jeddah, do our fight 2 weeks ago. So we work with both GEA and the Minister of Sport to bring the biggest events to Saudi Arabia. So Las Vegas of 1980 is now Riyadh, of 2024. So I think it's not just investing in the sport, it's bringing events to the kingdom, which allow events that otherwise are too expensive to be put together to be brought together for fans. Both of those are a big deal.
And when you think about some of, I don't know what to call them. Maybe they're subsidiaries of PFL, but it's like PFL Africa. I think you guys are doing one in Australia as well.
Yeah.
Can you explain to the average person like what these are and how they fit into the business?
We're super excited about this. For those who are fans of soccer, think of it as the PFL Champions League of MMA. So back to the 650 million fans, there are MMA fans worldwide. 80% of those are not in the United States. So roughly 550 million MMA fans are other places, not in the US. Well, the PFL and UFC, we export on TV our product, the PFL Global League and the UFC product to 170 countries. But what about serving them where they live? What about their own local heroes? What about the ability to attend those fights? That's what our strategy is about. Very different from the UFC. So we have PFL Europe, PFL Arabia, next year PFL Africa, in 2026 PFL Australia. So those are their own leagues that live there. The best regional fighters, all prime time in Europe or Africa or Australia, and they crown their own champions. So you become the champion of PFL Europe, you go to PFL Global. Same, PFL Arabia, you go to PFL Global. So it's the first connected true global sports network, a path for fighters to become champion and then go to the global league. So right now in PFL Europe, we're the co-leader in Europe with UFC. We had the biggest audience in France. We sold out 16,200 Accor Arena. And we had the most viewership in Europe this year with a single event, 3 million viewers. And that was not with our global product, Joe. That was our PFL Europe product. Why? Their own local heroes activating their own athletes. So the analogy is almost, why is MLS so big in the United States, even though it's the 8th soccer league by quality and by size? It's our own. So what we're giving fans around the world is their very own MMA league. We'll have PFL Latin America, PFL India, and PFL Asia by 2027. So the first true connected system for fans and for fighters. Now they all ladder up to global. That's the premium product where you all fight for $1 million and with the best fighters, top 20 ranked in the world. But it all starts with activating locally. That's what's so exciting. And that's what we're doing very, very different on a global basis than the UFC.
Yeah, I love that, especially because it seems like the markets are going to be at maturation by, what'd you say, 2028, right? So that is, the model is almost fully built out at this point, which is super exciting. But Donn, one of the other things I want to get your opinion on is media rights in general, right? You're the chairman and founder of this business. You obviously spend a lot of time thinking about today and how you're going to execute on your plan, but also the future. Media rights have changed a lot over even the last, 7 or 8 years, with streaming coming into play, and that's become much more popular. But now, as we start to look forward to the next 7 or 8 years, it feels like we're also going to see a lot of shift. Do you have an opinion of just kind of like how sports rights are going to change over that period of time?
Okay, absolutely. There's so much written the past 2 years about the NBA media right negotiations in business. The big story is going to be the UFC media rights. This is the last big thing that can move the needle for streaming, and that goes to market first quarter of 2025. The last time MMA was in the market was 7 years ago, pre-streaming. And it was when MMA was not recognized as a mainstream product. And there was one bidder, UFC. No other bidders. Think of that for what's now a blockbuster product. And UFC is the best performing sport for the dollar for ESPN. So there'll be 4, maybe 5 major bidders for UFC in first quarter of 2025. PFL's media package comes in first quarter of 2026. The NFL is actually on 9 networks. And if you add in the Power 4 college conferences, they're on 13 networks. So there's really 13 packages for football. There's only two packages for MMA, one from UFC, one from PFL. So where MMA goes in the next 24 months, I think will really shift hard to streaming, or will it still be simulcast on linear streaming? Netflix and Amazon will play big. What will happen to Warner Brothers Discovery? Will ESPN solidify their direct-to-consumer bundle? I think this next 12 months, as it regards MMA and media, is the most undertold story. Yes, the NBA was big, but UFC is going to get $8 billion over 10 years. And it's really underreported. And what MMA is going to do to shift the media landscape, very interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the things that I think about are, one, to your point, nothing else is really out for bid over the next handful of years. So UFC becomes much more important. But number 2 is ESPN is obviously going to want to keep the product because they're now starting their streaming service and their flagship product and want to have it there. But the addition of Netflix, Amazon, all those other ones, that's just going to drive the price higher. And my guess is you guys end up benefiting from that as well, kind of given the tailwinds in the business. But Donn, thank you so much for doing this. Good luck at your championship event at the end of this month. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. The clock is winding down here, but we have just enough time for some final buzz. So today I want to expand on something that Donn and I just talked about. And the idea is whether or not Netflix could be interested in buying the rights for UFC. Now, CNBC recently had an interview with Mark Shapiro over at the TKO Group, which represents the UFC. And he alluded to the fact that Netflix is certainly an interested party. And this makes a lot of sense to me because Netflix has dabbled in the world of professional sports for quite a while now. It started with these one-off tournaments for tennis or golf or things like that. But then they bought the rights to Monday Night WWE Raw. And the way that worked for me is it's episodic, so it gives them content throughout the year, which I think is especially important. And it's not necessarily sports because it's scripted. So it's a little bit different than the traditional sports you or I might think of. But then Netflix followed that up with a deal for Christmas Day NFL games. But to that point, they still haven't gone all in on one professional sports league yet. Which brings me to the point around whether or not they would be interested in the UFC. Now, if I had to bet on this, my guess is that the UFC will end up re-signing with ESPN because ESPN is placing a premium on the sports rights that they really desire as they transition to streaming. But I certainly wouldn't count out Netflix. They have a ton of money to spend. The advertising component of it makes a lot of sense with professional sports because the commercials are already built in. They're going to be doing it with the NFL, and they could potentially be doing it with the UFC before we know it. We're all out of time, so it's officially game over for this week. Thank you so much to Donn Davis and for all of you for joining us. Make sure to tune into Yahoo Finance Sports Report on Thursdays at 5 p.m. wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano. See you next time.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.